Could you open up to Nehemiah chapter 13? We are on the very last chapter of the book of Nehemiah. And today's message is a very practical, challenging, frustrating message. And you'll understand in a second. But before we take a look at Nehemiah 13, I just want to give you a little illustration to jump into the message. When my wife and I first got married, we just got back from Russia. We went to Russia, didn't have much money. We come back, and we really didn't have much money. We ate a lot of hot dogs and grilled cheese sandwiches as our main meal. And a couple felt really bad for us, so they gave us a car. It's an incredible car. It was a Subaru wagon that the lights didn't work in the back. The taillights didn't work, but it was free, so we took it. It was a wonderful car. But when you drove it at night, you had to slightly tap on the brake so the red lights went on. And I remember it was late at night, I was getting home on the highway, and I drove past a cop, and he followed me all the way. And he pulled me over, he goes, "Why are you braking the whole way?" And I said, I didn't know I was. I said, "Well, you need to fix that, or I'm fining you." So we had to get a new car. So I splurged, and I got a 1985 Toyota Tercel stick shift. It was great. It was rust brown with a little tinge of orange. But every time you went about 1,000 miles, the clutch would burn out. But it went pretty well. It was good gas mileage. But then we had our first child. We're like, we need to get something better than this Tercel. So we bought from a family a Mitsubishi sports car Eclipse. This is like a 1993 version. Really, TJ, do you remember that car? That little black car. So Michelle and I and Ginger with her little car seat fit perfectly in that Mitsubishi Eclipse. We could head down the highway about 95. It was a cool car. But then we had another child, so we're like, we got to get another car. So we traded in the Mitsubishi Eclipse, sold it. Actually, your son bought it, Steve. I don't think it lasted him too long. But we sold it to Steve's son. And then we went to the Caledonia auction, and we got this beauty. 1993 Dodge Caravan. It had a slight dent, so we got it cheaper. And this is a marvel of technological wonder. It was incredible. And we got it in Green Bay green, with that yellow. Look at that yellow trim. People thought we were Packers fans. No, never be a Packers fan. But it was a wonderful car. I can remember one day. So in that car, we were able to have, we ended up with six people in there, 4 kids in the back. One day, my wife and I are driving out on a nice spring day, my arms out the side, enjoying the sun, the glory of driving this van. People thought we were something driving this van. And you're going 50, 65, we get up to 70, and right when we hit about 72, the car goes boom. From drive, it goes slips right down to second gear. RPMs ramp up to 4,000. Like, man, we got to pull over. We pulled over. I let it sit a little bit, tapped the top, and said, you'll be fine, you'll be fine. Got back in, 50, 65, got up to 70. Bam! It goes down into second gear again. Kept doing that. And I just said, we just got to take it easy. But the more we drove it, the more it would slip into second. And every time it slipped into second, it would go crash harder and harder and harder. So we had to get a new car. But I hated leaving that beauty. What a car that was. But isn't that how life is? You're going along great, and all of a sudden something slips. Boom, it goes crashing down on you. Could be a transmission. Could be, you're going in the basement just to pick up a box of old books, and your back slips. Disc in your back slips. Or it's just compromising some of your moral convictions, which really leads you into habits that are destroying your life. It's called slippage. And in chapter 13 of Nehemiah, we're going to find they slipped. And it was not good. And so the title of this is, we want to leave a legacy, and to leave a legacy, you got to stop the slippage. You've got to be vigilant. You got to make sure you don't let your life be destroyed by the moral corrosion that can easily slip in without your awareness. We're going to read the first 6 verses. But we're going to tear it apart a little bit later on. So it begins in Nehemiah 13. On that day, the book of Moses was read aloud in the hearing of the people. And there was found written that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever be admitted to the assembly of God, because they had not met the Israelites with food and water, but had hired Balaam to call a curse on them. So they're reading the Bible, and they're reading the Old Testament story that Moses wrote about how Balaam called a curse on them, where the Ammonites and Moabites were basically intermarrying with God's people, which was sinful, because they were basically destroying the covenant God was making with the people. And so here in Nehemiah, they're reading this, and what we're going to see is they were falling back into that again. They were marrying Moabites and Ammonites that were living around them. And so here in verse 2 it says, because they had not met the Israelites with food, our God, however, turned the curse into a blessing. When the people heard this law, they excluded from Israel all who were of foreign descent. Then he goes into another problem. Elishab, the priest, had been put in charge of the storehouses. He was closely associated with Tobiah. We read about Tobiah. Tobiah was a bad man. He gave Tobiah a room in the temple where they were supposed to hold the grain and the incense and temple articles. And in verse 6 it says, but while all this was going on, I was not in Jerusalem. For in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I had returned to the king. Sometime later, I asked his permission and came back to Jerusalem. Here I learned about the evil thing, or evil things that were taking place. Here's what's going on. The book of Nehemiah. Part 1 we read where Nehemiah was called by God to come back and build the wall. Comes to Jerusalem, builds the wall, part 2 in 52 days. It's built in 52 days. After they built the wall, part 3 is they started reading the Bible and were convicted of their sin, and they had a revival. So Nehemiah, from the time he got there to after the revival, he was there about 12 years. He stayed about 12 years to make sure Jerusalem would get back on its feet. After 12 years, he went back home to where he was cupbearer again. And while he was away, what do they say when the cat's away? The mice will play. So what was happening is while he was away, slippage was occurring. They were going back to the original sins that they were committing before he showed up. I was talking to Will about this, and when Will was studying basically his passage, it says, some of the scholars said chapter 13 should have come before chapter 9 and 10. Because in chapter 8, they read the scriptures. They were convinced they needed to change. And here in 13, they read the scriptures, and they were convinced they should have changed. And then they had a revival, and then a revival occurred, and everything's hunky-dory. How could chapter 13 happen? People don't slip back into sin again, do they? After they make commitments? No. So what's happening in 13 is honestly what happens to every one of us. We'll get a spiritual revival. We'll have an incredible church service where we lay down our burdens. For a while we commit to it, and then all of a sudden, slippage starts sneaking in. Charles Wesley puts it like this in his song: we're prone to wander. Lord, I feel it. I'm prone to leave the God I love. And the reason's simple. We still have sin infested in us. Romans 7 says, I sometimes do things I don't want to do, and then I don't do the things I want to do. The way God designed it is by nature, He wants us to be perfect as He's perfect. He wants us to take a straight path and keep it going on and on and on and on. Getting better and better and better. And hopefully that's true. However, most of us take the meandering path, the path that often goes down and down and down. And this is what was happening in Israel. Once Nehemiah left, the first thing that happened, they started getting lazy. And that's what happens with all of us. Laxity sets in. What is laxity? It's kind of like where I just want to put it on cruise control. Just want to take it a little bit easy. Did you ever go to those water parks and they have that lazy river? and you get one of those inner tubes, and you sit on that inner tube, and you get your favorite cold drink, and you just let that lazy river take you around. That's fun. However, the problem with laxity, it will lead to compromise. Compromise means normally as a Christian, I should have these convictions. I make these decisions that are different from the normal current of culture, but when laziness sets in, I just kind of say, you know what, I'm done fighting. It's too hard. Jude says we have to contend for the faith. Paul says I beat my body and I make it my slave, so after I win others, I won't be disqualified for the prize. And often the question is, what is the prize? Is it salvation? No. The prize is letting Jesus be glorified in my life. And the way I let Jesus be glorified in my life is I discipline my body, I form convictions, I live by them. But what happens when I start getting lazy, I start compromising these convictions, and I say, I just don't want to be spoiling the party. Then when I start compromising too much, compromise always leads to corruption. Corruption in my own heart, corruption in the community of saints, corruption in my friend group, corruption at work, corruption in a nation. We are called to be salt and light. Salt preserves. Light shines on darkness. And when we compromise and we don't preserve anymore, what happens is the culture around is nobody to purify it. I think maybe the problem with our culture isn't necessarily the people that are wicked. It might be because the Christians no longer speak up. Laxity leads to compromise, which leads to corruption. And in the nation Israel, Nehemiah leaves, and what happens is you'll see there's two areas slippage started occurring. And these two areas are the same exact areas that happen in the church. The first one, I call it relational slippage, or relational ethics start being compromised. In this story, I read for you about the Moabites in verse 1, but here's the reason why. Go all the way back to verse 23 through 27. This is why they read that verse. So it says, moreover, in those days, what days? The days while I was gone, and then I came back. In those days, I saw men of Judah who had married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab, Ammonites and Moabites. Cultures around the Jews. The Jews were supposed to be dedicated to God in a covenantal relationship. But they decided to say, it's not that important. Look at how far it went. Verse 24. Half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod, or the language of one of the other peoples, and did not know how to speak the language of Judah. They compromised so much, they were losing their own culture, their own convictions. And then it goes on, I rebuked them. So Nehemiah came and he rebuked them. So what's happening here? Many of the Jews in the provinces around Jerusalem were mingling with the pagan cultures of the day and began allowing their children to marry in those families. They left the convictions of maintaining their Jewish purity so their kids would be happy. This is what was happening to Israel before Nehemiah came back. It's hard to not let your children love who they want to love. I mean, the great philosopher Selena Gomez says, the heart wants what it wants. The heart wants what it wants. And you got to give in to it, right? But God wanted a clean, pure nation. And so Moses, they read about Moses saying that, he forbids these marriages. But verse 24 said, not only did they not forbid it, but the people were slipping into their culture. For the church, the same thing happens. Actually, Paul warns us about it. Well, here in 2 Corinthians, he says, do not be yoked together with unbelievers. What's a yoke? Two oxen going in the same direction. Don't be yoked with unbeliever, because here you have a believer and then you put an unbeliever and they go in different directions and you're not plowing anything. It's not working. Why? What fellowship does light have with darkness? Light wants things of light, and darkness likes the darkness. But the problem is the darkness often has more sway. Here's how it happens. I'll show you the slippage. Very practical terms. Starts up here. God says a man will leave his father and mother, be united to his wife. The two will be one flesh. And they are not unequally yoked. So two believers get married so they can have a covenant relationship under God. And in that covenant relationship, God says the marriage bed is pure. So sex in a marriage like that is good and right and holy. However, it starts slipping. Well, what about missionary dating? What if my son dates a non-Christian girl for the purpose of leading her to Christ? What's wrong with that? They won't get too attached. You forgot what Selena Gomez said. The heart wants what it wants. Don't forget that. And so what happens, and Derek, you can confirm this with me. Him and I worked in youth ministry for many years. 9 times out of 10, darkness wins. Missionary dating, 9 times out of 10, darkness wins. Missionary dating isn't really true. So you go up here and it slips a little, and then you're about here, and then you start saying, well, why don't we sleep together? Because you don't know. We have to be compatible in the bed if we're ever going to take this any further, right? Oh, yeah, of course. I said I love her. What's wrong with sleeping together? I got to make sure I'm compatible. So then it slips a little more and says, why don't we live together? Because if we live together, then we'll know if we're compatible for a long-term relationship, even though statistics say if you live together, it really does not help with long-term relationships. And then it slips a little more. And then what happens? Divorce becomes easy. No-fault divorce. Because we just weren't compatible. Nobody's really to blame. And then it slips a little more, and what happens is the homosexual world says, what's wrong with us marrying my best friend? It's better than the heterosexuals. We're getting divorced left and right. I don't see the big deal. So kind of undercuts our statement on it's the best thing for you. And then what happens, to make it a little bit more exciting, you'll have these new open marriages. It's all the rage in Hollywood now. Probably heard of Will Smith and his wife Jaden Pinkett. They have this red table talk, and they decide to have an open marriage. Why? Because it helps stimulate our marriage, which means, have different partners come in and out. And then their daughter slips a little more and says, what's wrong with polyamorous marriages? What's polyamorous? It's not just having one man, one woman. It might be 2 men, 3 women. 4 men, 1 woman. Who knows? Anything goes. It's all the rage in Hollywood now. And then, what is now happening online, they have these cool new podcasts where these really cool guys interview girls and they try to figure out how many, what they would call body count, do you have? A body count is how many people you sleep with. And they'll have lined up, here's 4 girls. One has 1 body count, one has 70, one has 300, and one has 75. Try to guess which ones. Isn't that so cool? Romans 1 says, basically, when God gives them over, they will end up becoming filled with every kind of wickedness. When compromise slips, it leads to the bottom of the barrel of corruption. And that's where we're at, actually. And it has gone fast. Slippage, laxity in relational ethics leads to compromise on convictions and ends in complete corruption, where the culture now dictates the norms for the Christian. There's also what I would say religious error. So I'm using religion in a good way. There's a bad religion and a good religion. Bad religion is just you do it because your grandma did it. Just this old dogmatic approach. Good religion is the community of saints that want to gather together to proclaim the name of God in an organized way, which is called religion. And when the culture starts slipping, this organized group starts slipping. And it slips in three ways. And we see at Nehemiah, the first way is they will start allowing corrupt leadership to take over. But God says, we aren't supposed to give special favor or give any power to the proud. We should exalt the humble. In this case, in Nehemiah 13, we read in verse 4, this Elishib the priest, he was the high priest. He ruled the temple. Elishib the priest had been put in charge of the storerooms of the house of our God, and he was closely associated with Tobiah. If you remember, Tobiah was this guy that was jealous of Nehemiah and didn't want the wall built. You can read about it. He was the first one to mock the Jews. Well, he's buddies with Elishib, and so when Nehemiah is far away, in comes Tobiah and his buddies and says, man, clear me out of space. So they clear him out a room in the temple. They take out all of the grain and all of the artifacts that are meant to worship God, dust it out, put a couch in them for him, and give him a nice little room right in the temple, which is a very, very important position in the city where he could make deals with people. So Elishib brought this power-hungry guy, Tobiah, back in town. Now watch what happens when Nehemiah shows up in verse 6. But while all this was going on, I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I'd returned. Sometime later, I asked his permission and came back to Jerusalem. Here I learned about the evil thing Elishib had done in providing Tobiah a room in the courts of the house of God. I was greatly displeased, and I threw all of Tobiah's household goods out of the room. So he grabs Tobiah. He shows up back in town. He goes, you let that weasel back in here to take power? So he grabs Tobiah by the ear, throws him out, takes all of his stuff, rolls it up in a carpet, throws it over the walls of Jerusalem and says, now fumigate his room and get rid of that guy. The problem, what was happening, was the good old boy mentality of those in power. Those in power keep the power. This happens a lot in the church. When the church starts slipping, those in power stay in power. I was just reading 3 headlines this past week. There's what I would say, a pretty important seminary in the north where they've just got rid of their seminary president. And they forced him to resign because 200 students, faculty, and staff said he bullied and retaliated to anybody who disagreed with him. He wants power, and I'm going to keep my power. Those in power stay in power. I read this. At a church down south, a U.S. preacher asks his followers to help him buy his 4th private jet at a cost of $54 million. Poor guy. He needs a new jet. It's only $54 million. And they said, yes, sir. Pastor, we'll buy you a new plane. Or a megachurch pastor defends buying $200,000 Lamborghini for his wife. Taking advantage. People in power keep the power to take advantage of the people. That's slippage. They don't need a $200,000 Lamborghini. All you got to do is get a 1993 Dodge Caravan. It works just fine. Works just fine. The second slippage that was happening here was people were thinking practical living, doing hard work, pragmatic work where you see things done is really what's important. Spiritual life, maintaining the work of the church, Look what happens in verse 10 and 11. I also learned, and this is Nehemiah talking, I also learned that the portions assigned to the Levites, so Levites were the priests, those were the guys who day after day would offer sacrifices before God on behalf of the people. The portions assigned to the Levites had not been given to them. In other words, they said they took away their salaries. And all of the Levites and musicians responsible for the service had gone back to their own fields. So the people, the priests, which are their pastors, and the spiritual musicians, they had to go back and work in the fields again. Why? Because, doing practical work is so much more important than doing the work of God. But look what he says in verse 11. I rebuked the officials, and I asked them, why is the house of God neglected? Then I called them together and stationed them at their posts. All Judah brought the tithes of grain, new wine, and olive into the storerooms. And then I put Shelemiah, the priest Zadok, the scribe, and Levite named Pedaiah in charge of the storehouses, and made them give to the priest because they're trustworthy. So in other words, he brought back the importance of worship and roles that help facilitate worship, meaning the Levites and the musicians of worship. For many people, prayer and the study of the Word seems so impractical. Why do we pay somebody to do that? Often people see me reading the Bible and say, don't you have better things to do than just read? You know, some people need to be visited, or why don't you go visit big donors to get more money? Then we would get things going. And Pastor, by the way, what do you do after Sunday? You work one day a week, right? That's what you do. And so what happens is there is this downplaying of the importance of church. It's interesting to read online, if you go on Twitter, how many people think the church is just a joke. It's just a joke. In the book of Acts, chapter 6, verse 2, it talks about the apostles. It says, the apostles gathered the disciples together and said, it would not be right for us to neglect the ministry of the Word of God in order to wait on tables. Why wouldn't that be right? Because God's work really matters. And truthfully, I would say that's why I'm really excited to say about what we raised. You guys care about the work that's going on here. You guys care about Jesus' name consistently being proclaimed. It matters to you. You're willing to sacrifice for that. And that's rare these days because it's not practical, nor is it pragmatic. The third thing I would say is the third error is this whole idea of financial gain is the most important thing in life, but it can't replace the worship of God. In this case, look at 15 to 22. In those days, I saw people in Judah treading wine presses on the Sabbath. Now, if you're a Jew, wait a minute. The Sabbath is a day of rest. What? They're treading wine presses? Keep reading. And bringing grain and loading it on donkeys together with wine, grapes, figs, and all other kinds of loads. And they were bringing all this into Jerusalem on the Sabbath. Therefore, I warned them against selling food on that day. People from Tyre who lived in Jerusalem were bringing in fish and all kind of merchandise and selling them in Jerusalem on the Sabbath to the people of Judah. I rebuked the nobles of Judah and said to them, what is this wicked thing you are doing, desecrating the Sabbath days? Who are the nobles? The rich men. Nehemiah confronts them and says, stop making money on the day you should be worshiping. What's happening here is basically greed is replacing God as an idol. They wanted to make more money. And then Nehemiah in verse 18 says, you are setting up more wrath against Israel by desecrating the Sabbath. This is what brought all the calamity on us in the first place. In other words, the reason they went to Babylon for 70 years is because they desecrated the Sabbath. So God pulled them out of the country for 70 years so it would rest, and then he let them come back. And now they're going back, slipping back to the same thing. And it's irritating God again. He's saying you're stirring up God's wrath. What's the problem? They're putting greed over worship. Money in my pocket is more important than seeing God's name declared. The ways in which this show up in a modern church is really obvious, from a lack of tithing to people who choose a career simply because it offers more money than an opportunity to please God. Greed has replaced worship. And what another word for this is called secularism. It's secularism. And secularism is our religion, and it's a curse. It's a scourge. So what is secularism? Well, on the basic level, secularism, by definition, just means the separation of church and state. But on a practical level, it just means we're going to kick church out of everything. It's really not a separation of church and state. It's an annihilation of the church. So the church has no right to have a voice in politics. The church has no right to have a voice in the financial economy. The church has no right to have a voice in cultural norms, sexual norms, relational norms. Keep that stuff to yourself. Don't let it come into the public square. That's what secularism means. But on a more practical level, how do you know secularism's taken over your heart? One guy said it like this. This is really sad. He said this. Secularism is when people start worshiping work, when they start working at play, and when they start playing at worship. Why do they worship work? Because greed is their god. And man, when it talks about work, that's what they get serious about. That's really what matters. That's what they get all, like they will sacrifice hour upon hour for that because greed is God. They work at play because pleasure is the goal. It's all about me. The reason I like greed is because it gets me what I want. And then they play at worship. Why do they play at worship? Because they're really not fearing God anymore. I was talking to somebody on Friday, a good friend on Friday, and he was saying, what does it look like when God judges people or judges a country? Will he smash them, pour his wrath out on them? No, he lets this be the norm in everybody's heart. So Nehemiah comes along, sees it, and he says, we got to stop this. And the reason he wants to stop it is we got to, I want this city to leave a legacy for God, so we're going to stop it. And the way you stop slippage is in two ways that we're going to see in here. The first way is just verse 1. On that day, the book of Moses was read aloud in the hearing of the people, and there it was found written that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever be admitted, because they had met the Israelites with food and water. And in verse 3, when the people heard this law, basically they excluded people. They took it seriously. The best way to put it is I'd say the first thing that stops slippage is when it comes to the Word of God, we tremble at it. We tremble at God's Word. Here's why I use that word. The book of Isaiah is saying, he's saying, God says, this is the person I esteem, or this, God says, you want to know the guy that I get behind and I support? Here, he's humble in spirit, and he trembles at my word. That's the guy I support. What does it mean to tremble at God's word? It means to be, in the Hebrew, it means to be awe, A-W-E, filled after you read the Bible. A lot of people read the Bible. They'll read the Bible. Here's three major responses. First response is they read the Bible and they go, I don't understand a word of what I just read. Man, it's such a hard book. Another way people read it is they'll go, oh, ooh, that psalm's inspiring. I'd like to put that on a card. Next to a cup of coffee and get my Instagram. Ooh, that was almost drew a tear. The third way people read this Bible is they're like, I want to challenge you to read this. And I'll take the challenge as if I have an option. Like, I'll challenge you to game of chess. I'm not that good at it. I don't want to take it. But I'll play in Parcheesi. I'm really good at that. Accept the challenge. As if you can read this. You don't have to take the challenge, but I'm going to challenge you. Awe means, these are the very words of God, and this is exactly how he thinks. It's exactly how he thinks. When I read it, it should, like one writer said, be like an ice pick to my brain. I'm not doing this. Should be trembling at his word. Second thing we find in Nehemiah, and this is kind of funny. All right, so let's go to Nehemiah 13. This is crazy, truthfully. Hold on. So the second thing that stops slippage is good leaders, or people in position of authority to actually lead. So if you're given a role, it gives you authority, whether it be a parent, a coach, a teacher, pastor. You lead. You take it serious. So Nehemiah did, and watch what happens. The first part's not that shocking. Verses 20 and 21. So they were violating the Sabbath. Verse 20. Actually, let's begin in verse 9. When evening shadows fell on the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I ordered the doors to be shut and not open until the Sabbath was over. So we're not having any business here because tomorrow's the Sabbath. And I'm sure they were pretty upset. I stationed some of my own men at the gates so that no load could be brought in on the Sabbath day. Once or twice, the merchants and sellers of all kind of goods spent the night outside Jerusalem, but I warned them and said, why do you spend the night by the wall? If you do this again, I'm going to arrest you. So we're not having this. We're done. And if you keep pushing me, I'm going to arrest you. Like, he takes it very serious. Now, that's not too bad. Like, actually, he was a good leader. He had some rules and said, we're not going to break these rules. And everybody eventually complied because he said, I'll arrest you if you push it. Now, look at this. So remember when they're intermarrying? They're marrying Ammonites and Moabites and Ashdod people, and the kids started, not knowing their language. Look at verse 13:25. This reminds me of Derek Max. Here's what it says. So you got verse 24. Half of the children spoke the language of Ashdod or the language of one of the other peoples and did not know how to speak the language of Judah. Now remember, I'm going to read 25. This is what the leaders did. Now if a leader did this, it's hilarious actually. Verse 25. I rebuked them and called curses down on them. I beat some of the men and pulled out their hair. I made them take an oath in God's name and said, you are not to give your daughters in marriage to their sons. So he'd take fathers who are marrying their sons he'd pull out their hair. You would not last long as a leader in our country if you did that. I'll bet you this can go online and people would say, do you hear what Pastor Chris is preaching? You can pull out people's hair. Who's sinning? Would you rather have no hair or damnation? What's your choice? What's your choice? That's really what's going on. So basically what's happening is not only is the Word of God stopping them from slippage, but godly leaders are taking their role seriously and saying, no, we're not going to do this. No. We're just not going to do this. I was talking to Dave Cummings, and he said a very interesting thing. He read this chapter, and he said, what I've noticed is, he said, one strong leader can make all the difference in the world and the community. Exactly. You, if you are a leader, can change the whole culture of your house and of your church if you take it seriously. It's really crazy how really people want a leader. They're looking for somebody who believes in something enough that they'll stand up and say, no more. No more. I get really embarrassed about this. When my wife and I went to Russia for a year. Like, we would lead Bible studies of kids about 9 and 10 and 11. Michelle would have a women's group, but I would have 9, 10, and 11-year-olds. And they'd be reading the Bible, and they'd ask questions like, why did God allow Satan to sin? And all, like, they were really into it. Then I came here, and I'm teaching 9 and 10 and 11 years old. And I couldn't even get them to open the Bible, and they're pulling each other's hair, and they're laughing. And the only way I can get them to watch is watch VeggieTales. And one day, I blew up, and I threw my Bible across the room. And I said, do you guys realize that this Bible has people like Isaiah who was sawn in half for what he wrote down there? Do you realize John, who wrote the book of John, was boiled in oil for what he wrote? I was so mad. I wish I would be mad again like that. I mellowed out, Dan. You mellowed me out. But after that class, those kids listen. I'll tell you that. They listen. They listen. Why did Nehemiah care so much? Look at Nehemiah 14. 13, 14. Why did he care so much? He comes back in town and his heart's broken. Why does he care so much? Because he says, remember me for this, my God, and do not blot me out. Not blot out what I have so faithfully done for the house of my God and its services. Look at verse 22. Verse 22, then I commanded the Levites to purify themselves and go and guard the gates, to keep the Sabbath day holy. Remember me for this also, my God, and show mercy to me according to your great love. And look at the verse 31. I also made provisions for contributions of wood at designated time and for first fruits. Remember me with favor, my God. He ends by just saying, remember me for this. He wants to leave a legacy that goes to the halls of eternity for his name. Why did he do this? He wants to leave a legacy in the halls of eternity for his name's sake. Remember me, God, in eternal councils. Do you know in eternal councils, those who stand up for God on earth, he is going to declare before the angels. He's going to promote your name before the angels when you stand up for small things down here. Remember me, O God, for this. Leave a legacy.